Throughout history, many nations have suffered a physical defeat, but that has never marked the end of a nation. But when a nation has become the victim of a psychological defeat, then that marks the end of a nation. Here is the story of Ibn Khaldun, the story that you will hear for the first time. 1. Ibn Khaldun was born in Tunisia in 1332, to an Andalusian family, had migrated to Africa in the 7th century A. Ibn Khaldun's origin goes back to the Yemeni Arabs in Hadramaut, and his lineage goes back to Val bin Hayyar according to the narration of Ibn Hazm al-Andalusi. Ibn Khaldun mentioned that there were 6 fathers between him and Val, but the narration was doubted by him himself. Given that 6 fathers are not enough to cut off 6.5 centuries, if his grandfather entered Andalusia at the time of the conquest, then names were dropped from his lineage, as he believes that each century has 3 fathers, and accordingly, their number must be 20. Ibn Khaldun traces his lineage back to one of the ruling houses in Andalusia, and one of his ancestors settled there in the era of the conquest, where he first settled in the city of Carmona before moving to Seville. Khaldun was among those who rebelled against him, as they were from the senior families of Seville, when the state split in Andalusia, and began to fall at the hands of the king of Castile. Prince Abu Zakaria al-Hafsi fled from it in the year 1223 and went to Africa. Banu Khaldun left with him for fear of a bad outcome. If Seville fell into the hands of the Christians, Banu Khaldun enjoyed prestige and power in the Hafsid state, and they lived through the state's battles with the Kharijites over it. As for Ibn Khaldun's father, he renounced the political life and resorted to a life of study and science. He excelled in jurisprudence, linguistics, and composed poetry. He remained in his knowledge until his death during the Great Annihilation or the Sweeping Plague in the year 1349. When Ibn Khaldun was 18 years old, Ibn Khaldun grew up on the legacy of his family, with a long history of knowledge, so he persevered in studying under his father, who was his first teacher. So he read and memorized the Quran and studied the 7 readings, hadith, interpretation and jurisprudence, in addition the grammar and language. Investing in the teachers of Tunisia, which was one of the most prominent centers of science and literature in the Maghreb, Ibn Khaldun mentioned the names of his sheikhs in every science and was interested in translating their works and talked about some of the books he studied. After that, the Great Annihilation, or the Sweeping Plague, as Ibn Khaldun calls it, spread, and the epidemic spread to the lands of Islam, from Samarkand to the far Maghreb, as it spread in Italy and other European countries, and Ibn Khaldun suffered grief because of the epidemic, as he lost most of his teachers and elders in addition to his parents. Banu Khaldun lived a prosperous life under the Hafsid state, and expanded their influence, but as soon as Ibn Khaldun reached the age of majority, signs of the dissolution of the state appeared, after a group of unrest struck Africa and culminated in a plague epidemic. The guardian of Sultan Abu Ishaq Ibrahim ibn Abi Bakr, but he was suspicious of the conditions of the state in Tunisia, and witnessed the transfer of sheikhs and scholars to the far Maghreb to live under the powerful and newly emerging Marinid state. The departure affected the soul of Ibn Khaldun, but his older brother repelled him, provided that the emir of Constantine Abu Zayd crawled to Tunisia in the beginning of the year 1353. Ibn Khaldun spent a short time in where he stayed with the sheikhs of some Almoravids before he went to Ceuta, and then went to Gafsa, where he was met by some of the jurists of Tunisia, and met with him in a lecture by the emir of Constantine, and from there he traveled to Biskra and spent the winter there, and he stayed as a guest with its owner, Yusuf bin Muzni. After the death of the king of Morocco, Al-Aqsa, Sultan Abi al-Hassan, following the departure of his son, Sultan Abi Inan, to him, who regained lands that were stolen during the era of his father, and annexed Bejaya to his sultan. After its ruler declared his obedience, Sultan Abu Anan resided in Tlemcen, and during this period Ibn Khaldun sought to meet him, and it was narrated that the sultan honored him, more than he expected, and sent him with his chamberlain Ibn Abi Amr to Bayjaya, to witness the pledge of allegiance to him. Then the Sultan honored them upon his return again, before he left for Fez, and Ibn Khaldun remains with Ibn Abi Amr was in Bayjaya until the end of 1353. After his fame spread and the mention of his knowledge grew, Abd al-Rahman ibn Khaldun was summoned to the court of Sultan Abu Inan in the year 1354. The Sultan appointed him as a member of his scholarly council and assigned him to witness the prayers with him, and he continued to bring him closer and closer until he appointed him. The following year, among his scribes and signatories, I had not entrusted the like of it to my predecessor. Good treatment and work in the council of the Sultan did not prevent Ibn Khaldun from delving into political intrigues. So a relationship developed between him and Prince Muhammad, the ousted ruler of Bayjaya, and the latter was a prisoner in Fez. He was located between his family and Bani Hafs. Sultan Abi Anan was bedridden at the time when he heard about Ibn Khaldun's plot. So he ordered his arrest in early 1357, and despite his later release of the Emir of Bayjaya, he kept Ibn Khaldun in his shackles for 2 years. His envy for arranging intrigues for him, and they were able to throw him into a conspiracy with the deposed Emir of Bayjaya. Ibn Khaldun pleaded with Sultan Abi Anan, but the latter refused to pardon him until he raised a poem of about 200 verses to him seeking his sympathy and pardon. But the disease became severe for the Sultan, and death overtook him at the end of 1358 AD, and he did not fulfill the promise of pardon. So Ibn Khaldun remained shackled until Al-Hasan ibn Umar, the caretaker of the state after the Sultan, took the initiative to release him and restore him to his duties and take good care of him. But the disease became severe for the Sultan. Al-Hasan ibn Umar ruled power and got rid of his son and his heir, Abu Zayn, and expelled all competitors in that case. As was the case of his predecessors, has Abu Anan snatched the throne from his father and exiled his brothers to Andalusia. The oppression of Ibn Omar caused a coup in Fez, and Mansur ibn Sulaiman came to power. At that time, Ibn Khaldun did an unappreciated act, and it seemed that his behavior against Sultan Abu Anan was not a temporary mistake, but rather a firm principle. Ibn Khaldun was frank in portraying his inclination towards power, so the goal was for him to justify action even if he met charity with denial. But Ibn Khaldun's loyalty to Sultan Mansur ibn Sulaiman did not last. Sultan Abu Salim bin Abi Anan arrived from Andalusia to Gamaza and began calling people to him. So they agreed. To confirm his invitation, he contacted Ibn Khaldun secretly, and he accepted it. And he tried to convince the sheikhs and dignitaries of Abu Salim's right to the authority of his father. After that, Ibn Khaldun traveled with a group of sheikhs and jurists from the neighborhood of Mansur ibn Sulaiman to join Abu Salim, and at that time Ibn Khaldun presented his plan to isolate Mansur. So he walked with his people and Ibn Khaldun in their knees towards Fez, and Sultan Mansur ibn Sulaiman fled, and Ibn Khaldun justifies his abandonment of Ibn Sulaiman by saying, "When I saw the imbalance of his conditions and the fate of the matter to the Sultan, after Abi Salim seized power, Ibn Khaldun was appointed the writer of secrets and creation, and he was a subject of trust and sympathy. Among the most famous of what he included was a poem he raised to the Sultan on the birthday of the Prophet, in which he enumerates the virtues and miracles of the Prophet and praises the Sultan. This period was golden for Ibn Khaldun, as his poetry became famous and his prose became famous in Morocco and Andalusia, and the influence of the Qur'a order and the pervasiveness of nature. Ibn Khaldun remained the writer of secrets and creation with Sultan Abu Salim for nearly 2 years, and after that he had the plan of grievances, which, according to his description, is a function mixed with the power of power and half-i.e. justice of the judiciary, and it needs exaggeration and great ought to establish the truth and punish the oppressor. But his position did not last with the Sultan. The competition was permanent between the men of the state and the Sultan's friend and fellow exile, Al-Khatib ibn Marzuq reached the power that was close to him. So he took control of it and placed his hand on all its joints. So he corrupted between its men and its ruler until the discontent with him reached the joints of the entire government. So the people revolted against him under the leadership of the minister Omar ibn Abdullah, who then reached the head of the state. Although Ibn Khaldun supported the new sultan and pledged allegiance to him, the result did not please him. An old friendship brought him together with the minister, Omar ibn Abdullah, since the time of Asabiyyah, and he hoped that this relationship would contribute to him assuming high positions in the state, such as the janitor and the ministry, but none of this happened, and he resigned from his posts, which prompted the new sultan to resent him and disavow him. The resentment prompted Ibn Khaldun to seek permission to travel to Tunisia, but his request was rejected for fear that he would pass through Abu Hamo, the emir of Tlemcen, so it was only for him to seek the help of Masud ibn Masi, the colleague of Minister Omar and his son-in-law. So he entered on him on the day of Fitr, and sought him a poem he said at the beginning. So he asked permission for him to travel on the condition that he avoid Tlemcen, and not pass through it. So Ibn Khaldun accepted, and sent his wife and children to their uncles in Constantine, and he chose to travel to Andalusia. Ibn Khaldun arrived in Granada on the 8th of Rabi al-Awwal, in the year 1362, so the Sultan celebrated him and honored him and made him among his entourage, just as Ibn al-Khatib had a lot of care and benevolence. Seville, upon his arrival, the king honored him and welcomed him. During his stay in Seville, Ibn Khaldun, accompanied by the king of Castile, witnessed the past of his family in Andalusia, as it was a well-known family, and the king spoke about its history. The king introduced him to a Jewish doctor, named Ibrahim ibn Zarzar. Ibn Khaldun met him in the council of Sultan Asabiyyah when he was summoned to treat him. Ibn Khaldun says that the king of Castile offered him to stay within his entourage, restore his family's legacy, and play the role of advising the followers of power in Castile. But he preferred to return to Granada. Despite the great importance that Ibn Khaldun put forward in his reading of history, his appearance at the end of the golden age of Islam made his legacy pervade for centuries, so the East almost ignored him and the West knew nothing about him, until 1697, when the first translations were published in the Darblot Encyclopedia of the French Orientalist Barthélemy Herblot, with errors, and as soon as it was published in this poor condition, Ibn Khaldun's ideas returned to ignorance for centuries until the French Orientalist de Sacy published in 1806 passages from the introduction next to Ibn Khaldun's translation in his dictionary, and returned in 1816 to publish a more complete translation of the introduction in the dictionary of general translations, and in the same year, the Orientalists published the Austrian von Hammer, a treatise in German on the decline of Islam after the first 3 centuries of migration, in which he spoke of Ibn Khaldun's ideas on the rise and dissolution of states and kingdoms, describing him as the Arab Montesquieu. Arab and Western interest in the ideas of Ibn Khaldun continued during the 19th century, and historians continued to publish parts of his introduction until 1858, when Karmer published the entire introduction in its Arabic text, to publish, a few years later, de Sacy the full French translation of the introduction, and then the importance of Ibn Khaldun's ideas to Western thought became clear. Westerners studied it a lot after they saw in his ideas scientific achievements that Western thought did not know until after many ages. Perhaps the most prominent person who cared about Ibn Khaldun as a historian was the Austrian Alfred von Kremer, who wrote his famous treatise Ibn Khaldun and his history of the civilization of Islamic countries, and then submitted it to the Vienna Academy of Sciences. In 1879, Kremer considered that Ibn Khaldun was a historian of the civilization of Islamic peoples, as he was the first to deal with its topics with research and study. He talked about political systems, types of government, general plans, economic systems, taxes, professions, crafts and crafts. Then he dealt with culture and arts, their types and ways of their development in the Islamic world. These patterns that Ibn Khaldun talked about were only images of the main topic of research, which is human civilization. Kramer's opinion was not fully supported. Nathaniel Schmidt, who was the last to study Ibn Khaldun, commented in his book Ibn Khaldun, historian, sociologist and philosopher, considering that if we want to describe Ibn Khaldun as a historian, we must decide whether he explicitly intends to provide illustrative examples of what he considers the essence of history, or did he intend to explain to us the correct application of the historical rules that he decided on. He adds that the book explanation of Ibn Khaldun in the introduction, perhaps it would have opened a new era in historical studies, had it not been for describing a civilization heading towards dissolution, and written in an unknown language by the young nations that followed his mission. The Dutch philosopher de Boer, in his book History of Philosophy in Islam, considers that Ibn Khaldun was not a historian but a philosopher, and places him in Islamic history alongside Ibn Sina, al-Ghazali, Ibn Rushd, and Ibn Tufayl, and describes him as equanimity and denial of the rational principle in favor of the simple Islamic principle, either for personal or political considerations. But despite that, it is believed that religion did not affect Ibn Khaldun as much as it affected Aristotle and Platonism, in addition to being influenced by Plato's Republic and the ideas of Pythagoras. In addition to being influenced by his predecessors, especially by al-Masudi, how do people obtain their strength? Why do they fight each other? And how civilizations arise from the rough ground to flourish, and become soft until they decay and collapse, just as he was without a predecessor, so he remained without a successor. The social philosophy built by Ibn Khaldun had the lion's share in studies. Ludwig Gumplevich believes that he was a sociologist, and shows that he preceded many non-Arab philosophers in his views. For example, he talked about the 3 generations of the rise and dissolution of states before Ottokar Lawrence in the late 19th century, and he elaborated on the importance of Ibn Khaldun, placing him earlier than Auguste Comte and John Battista Vico, who was placed by the Italians at the head of sociology, where he said, "A pious Muslim came and studied social phenomena with a balanced mind, and he came out of his studies with deep opinions, and what he wrote was what we call today sociology." He continues that Ibn Khaldun's views indicate that he knew the law of imitation of the medium 5 centuries before the advent of Charles Darwin. As for his analogy of man to animals, in compliance with social laws, this indicates his discovery of the unity of matter before he knew Ernest Haeckel. Ibn Khaldun's recommendations in governance are identical to the procedures taken by the leaders of European states in the Middle Ages. This was preceded by Machiavelli, who wrote about these procedures nearly a century later in his book The Prince. Ibn Khaldun was able to explore the origins of the spiritual and temporal powers as they are said today by professors of political law and law canon. There is a scholar other than Gumplevich, Ferrero-Fade, who saw Gumplevich's opinion and said Ibn Khaldun's wit, and the Russian writer Levin agreed with them, who considered Ibn Khaldun a social philosopher. Ibn Khaldun's ideas were also studied from an economic point of view, where his social views overlapped with the history of societies and their living conditions at the same time. Stefano Closio looked at Ibn Khaldun through his economic influence, and he says, Ibn Khaldun in terms of the gender from which he descended, the country in which he was born, and the civilization to which he belongs, he can be placed in the ranks of the great men who occupy the highest position in history. He described him as the first to deal with issues related to the philosophy of history, and analyzed his theory of social algebra, as he considers that Ibn Khaldun spoke about it in his description of the generations of Bedouins and urbanites. The difference of generations in their conditions is due to the difference in their livelihood. Closio reads the ideas of Ibn Khaldun as a socio-economist, and believes that he discovered the principles of social justice and political economy earlier than Karl Marx, Considran, and Bakunin. So, Ibn Khaldun analyzed the work of the state from an economic point of view, and read the methods of ownership and types of ownership, and divided work into free and wage, and knew the laws of supply and demand. And thus Ibn Khaldun was an innovative economist, who applied the foundations of political economy before Western scholars. Closio concludes by saying, if Ibn Khaldun's theories about the complex life of society put him at the forefront of the philosophers of history, then his understanding of the role played by work, property, and wages puts him at the forefront of modern economists. Ibn Khaldun was distinguished from other historians in general, and Muslim historians in particular, with his vision of history. He did not see in it a mere narration of events, but rather a science that should be studied according to a clear methodology. And his vision ended up discovering a kind of social philosophy that he called human civilization, which he describes as a newcomer to the craft, strange inclination, and of great benefit. And he believes that this science has many benefits, as it highlights the truth from falsehood in what has been reported by tongues about historical events by looking at human civilization. If we do that, we will come to laws that scrutinize truth from falsehood in news in a way that leaves no doubt. Thus, the whole human society is a tool for contemplation and study to consider the history of societies by studying and analyzing the emergence of society, its stability and its transition between weakness and strength, youth and old age, rise and fall, so that we know the characteristics of this society, and elements of its formation and organization. Objectively, Ibn Khaldun sees in the human civilization that it is what is presented in their meeting of the conditions of civilization in possession, earning, science and crafts with demonstrative faces, with which the investigation of private and public knowledge becomes clear, and delusions and doubts are repelled by them. Ibn Khaldun looked at the events that took place in the history of states with intense contemplation, so he saw permanent social phenomena that are not related to time, and these phenomena represent the life of society and link the past to the future. His study of history turned into a belief in history, and he believed that there should be a correct and clear method for investigating historical events and social systems. In order to reach the correct reading of history as a science, historians must avoid falling into three major mistakes. The first is partisanship. If history was narrated according to the point of view of some partisans of a specific Islamic approach, then the Umayyad state would have the most odious description without any benign characteristic, and similar to the phenomenon of partisanship among historians, who exaggerate the flattery of the powerful, and others who excessively support a king without considering his disadvantages, or regardless of them. As for the second mistake, it is the historian's acceptance of everything that was narrated before him, so he takes the information without careful examination. And the most appropriate solution to avoid this error is in scrutiny with a lot of care and contemplation. And here it is necessary to rely on the discoveries of Muslims in the science of man and the wound and the modification that were used by the historians of the Prophet's Sunnah, so they investigated all the hadiths and returned every meaning to its origin, until the hadiths became more like dictionaries that one returns to in order to gain information or advice, and so must be history. So everything that is mentioned in it must be verified in order for it to be a lexicon for those who want it. Attention must be paid to the number of historians of one incident, as the narration of 5 historians is closer to authentication than the narration of one historian. As for the third mistake, which Ibn Khaldun gave great importance, it is ignorance of the nature of conditions in urbanization, the privilege of being able to scrutinize and verify information. Ibn Khaldun comments on these 3 sins, but he gives the third sin great importance, and he believes that historical issues cannot be subjected to wounding and modification, except after matching them with the natures of urbanization in its time, that is, if the narration contradicts the time, place, and circumstances to which the chronicled phenomenon was exposed. Ibn Khaldun sets an example of this, with the journey of the King of India on the day he went out to travel, and before that he counted the number of the population of his kingdom, including women, men, and children, and gave them a livelihood for 6 months upon his return. The denial of this incident because it does not agree with the conditions of urbanization. Ibn Khaldun's years in Cairo ended. There is no complete certainty of his place of residence, but Al-Jamal al-Bashbishi says that he saw Ibn Khaldun near Al-Salihiyah in Cairo, heading to his house, which indicates that his residence is located in the neighborhood between Khazran or the neighborhoods close to it, where the place is close to his job as a judge for the Malikas, and because the Iwan of the Maliki jurist was soon to. As for after his return from Damascus, Al-Jamal al-Bashbishi indicates that he settled on the sea, which indicates his choice to live in one of the neighborhoods overlooking the Nile, and perhaps it was the island of Al-Rada or the opposite bank of Al-Fustat. Ibn Khaldun died nearly a quarter of a century after his stay in Cairo at the age of 76 years on the 26th of Ramadan 808 AH. The princes in the 8th century AH. Outside Bab al-Nasr towards Al-Radaniya Abbasiyah, a cemetery built by the Sufis of the Conkas, and Ibn Khaldun was buried in it because he was the sheikh of the Conca Baybars. This was the story of Ibn Khaldun. To a new story with another legend.